to do another lesson in ELA with you, and we're still focusing on Mr. Tannen's tie troubles. This will be our last read of this text, and we're not going to go through the story in the traditional way where we read all of the words and we look at all of the pictures. We're going to kind of do a real quick recap review of all of the components of the story, because today we're going to focus on two standards. We're going to continue our work with RL 2.5, where we're describing the overall structure of a story, where we talk about the beginning, how that introduces the story, and the ending, how that concludes the action. And we're also going to talk a little bit about RL 3.7. And that's where we are using the information gained from the illustrations and the words in our text to demonstrate understanding of the characters, setting, and the plot. Now, in order to do this, we have to be familiar with the story elements. So the anchor chart behind me kind of outlines what those are, and I know you know these, so this will be a real quick review for you there. The story elements include the characters, the setting, and the plot. The characters are the who. Who are we talking about in the story? They can be animals, they can be people, they can be things. So when we think about this text, Mr. Tannen's Tie Trouble, who are the characters in this story? I heard somebody say Mr. Tannen. He's our main character. He's the most important character in our story. We've got Mrs. Sweetapple, Mr. Crabapple. Excellent. The baker, the children, all of the people who are in this town that Mr. Tannen is trying to use to solve his problem, and the people he's trying to help by coming up with a solution. Great job. Now the setting is when and where. Sometimes the setting will be day or night. It could be a special date on a calendar. It could be a certain time of day. In this text, we don't necessarily know when. We don't know the year or the month, but we can guess it's going to be sometime between August and June because students are in school. And we also know where. Where is this story taking place? Excellent job. It's taking place at a school in a town, and Mr. Tannen is responsible for that school. He's the principal. So we know that at the playground is the where of this story. Now the plot is what happens. We have a problem, there's a sad face here, and a solution at the end, that's the happy face. And these story elements really help us to get more detail about the plot structure. So we focused the last couple of times that we've read this story on the plot structure, identifying the beginning, the rising action, the climax, the end. We're going to start by reviewing those components, and then we're going to layer in some of these story elements to make sure that we really understand the text. Now, throughout this story, we began, hint, hint, by identifying that Mr. Tannen was the principal of this school, and he loved the playground, but it needed some work. And he really needed to identify a way that he could fix that problem, that he could fix the playground for the students at his school. This all happens in the beginning, so pages 16 and 17, where we're setting the stage and we're being introduced to our characters, introduced to kind of those beginning ideas of the story so that we can begin to understand what's going to happen as we read. As we move to the next two pages, we've got 18, 19, 20, all of these pages that we're going to see in a minute. This is where our rising action comes into place, okay? This is where Mr. Tannen is trying to figure out, how am I going to get this money? The school board says they cannot help me. The kids are going to be really disappointed if I can't figure out a way to fix up this playground for them. He's thinking, and then his boss says, I wish our account was as full as your tie closet. And that gets Mr. Tannen thinking. That's where we've been introduced to this problem. Mr. Tannen starts trying to come up with a solution to solve it. As full as my tie closet, he's thinking to himself. Then we move into the next couple of pages. Mr. Tannen is jazzed. He jumps up. He's like, that's it, my ties. School will have a new playground. And at this point, we can start to to make some inferences about what Mr. Tannen might be coming up with in terms of a solution, but we don't know anything just yet. We're still in that rising action. We're still identifying some of those key components of the story that are going to help us to identify what the author wants us to know. But from this illustration and the words, Mr. Tannen seems very pleased, so we must know that he's got a good idea in his brain to fix his problem. We've got pages 20 and 21, where we're meeting the town, where we're still on the playground for the big idea, but we know he's in a town, and we see in the illustration he's having a tie auction at 7 p.m. at his school. All his ties are going to be sold. He's putting these up everywhere because he wants the entire town to know this is happening. And we're still in that rising action phase. We're still identifying all of those key details that are going to help us figure out how Mr. Tannen solves his problem. As we move through the text, and we're moving to pages 22 and 23. Now we see people on the phone, right? And this is an important page, and I'm going to pause here. Because on this page, we're seeing in the illustration the faces of people. Look at Mrs. Sweetapple. She's like, what? She's on that phone and her face looks crazy. We've got the baker, Monsieur Bijot, who's like, oh my gosh, his mouth is in a little O, he's surprised, his eyes are wide. These key details in the illustrations are there on purpose to help us really connect with what the author is trying to tell us about how the characters are feeling. Sometimes these details happen in the text and sometimes they happen in the illustration. Sometimes you see them in both places, but it's really powerful when we know how to identify these story elements and how to take apart all of these little clues that are left in the text for us. So we can tell people are surprised, people are like, what? Even over here, the man at the zoo is like, Mr. Tannen's selling his ties, he's freaking out, there's an exclamation point, it's written in bold, so the author wants you to know this is important information. He's got his hand on his head, he cannot believe this. So all of these details are telling us that the characters are shocked that Mr. Tannen is going to sell his ties. At this moment in the text, I have an important question for you. What part of the story are we in? When does the author show the other characters on the phone shocked that Mr. Tannen is going to sell his ties? Our options are in the beginning, B, during the rising action, C, during the climax, or D, at the end. So which part of the story are we in right now when we see all of these shocked faces that cannot believe that Mr. Tannen is going to sell his ties? Excellent job. We know it's not in the beginning because we've already moved from the beginning, the introduction of characters, into identifying what the problem is. And as soon as we've identified what that problem is in the story, we've moved into rising action. So it might be B, but before we know for sure, let's make sure C or D is not correct. C says during the climax. Well, in the climax, we've got a solution to the problem and something big is about to happen. It could be here, but let's read on, make sure there's nothing else that makes more sense than this answer. D, at the end. Is it likely that the story, right in the middle of the text, this is where it ends, the end, the next page is the end? No. So we know it can't be A and we know it can't be D. B during the rising action or C during the climax. This could feel a little bit tricky. Remember that the rising action is where we are identifying a solution. Have we identified and used that solution yet? Or are we still in the process of coming up with that solution and seeing it play out in the story? That's right. So we are on B, during the rising action at this point in the text. Very good job. I know it wasn't very easy, but you guys are reading experts. As we continue to move through the story, we can identify that we're in that rising action, and here Mr. Tannen is. He is ready to sell off his ties to help raise some money for his school. We're still being introduced to that rising action. We're still getting all the information, all the details from the story elements. Page 26, 27, and page 28. are all there to give us more detail about how Mr. Tannen's ties are going to solve this problem. And on 28, we can see the progress finally starting to happen. So this is a signal that we're shifting out of the rising action and moving into our next part of our plot, which is the climax. So he sees it's being built, and then on page 29, we are introduced to its opening day. He's going to get to see the playground. The whole town turns out. They're ready to see it, to see all of the money that was raised from them buying these ties and Mr. Tannen selling the ties. What a beautiful playground exists so the kids can play. Now we're in that climax where even though we've got our solution, something big is still about to happen. And there it is, Mr. Tannen's beautiful playground. They've named it after him because he put all this work into making sure that it was available and ready and brand new for the kiddos. And here, page 30 and 31 and 32, the town tells Mr. Tannen, we're giving you back your ties. You had this idea, you were willing to give your ties to get a playground, not for yourself, but for your students. And we thought that was so wonderful that we want to give you back your ties because you're the best principal. Really, really cool message in this story. And it is always more important to give than get. And then, when we've addressed our climax, we know that the big idea here is Mr. Tannen is getting all of his ties back because of all of the beautiful work he did to make the playground happen. We finally reach the end, pages 32 to 35, where Mr. Tannen and his ties are together again. And he was so excited because he got to put on his swing and slide tie to match the playground, and he felt very good. So in your notebooks, what I'd love for you to do is to create a beginning, rising action, climax, and end chart. And I've written for you here the pages that these different components of the plot exist. Try to identify, based on the discussions we had today and the last time we read, which elements in the story fit into which parts of the plot. Work on this independently as your activity that goes along with the story. Remember, the beginning is where we're introduced to people. So who were we introduced to and when? The rising action. What's the problem? What's the solution? The climax. Where did something big happen after the problem had already been solved? Something new and exciting. And at the end, how did the story get tied up? All loose ends are taken care of. How did the author leave us in this story? When you finished that, think about the story elements. We've identified character setting and the plot, very, very detailed, throughout our reading of this text. But also think about this. How must Mr. Tannen feel about his students? He sold off all of his ties so that they could have a playground. Do you think he feels bothered by them? Do you think he cares about them very much? Do you think he thinks they could work a little bit harder? Or do you think he doesn't really worry about them? He figures whatever happens, happens. Think about those details in our characters. Think about the setting. Think about how he must have felt at the end of the story when he finally got his ties back. Knowing he did a good job, that the playground was built, and he got to keep his ties. As you're filling out your rising action, your plot chart, try to think about those story elements so that you can really understand this text. I had a great time learning with you today, and I can't wait to start a brand new text with you next Monday. So keep reading, have a great weekend, and I'll see you Monday.